Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar, and I'm Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics. A very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us this afternoon for this event, the next in our Fact and Fiction series, where we look at a recently published book and have a discussion around it with experts who know and have done research on the book and its interests and its wider interests. It's also the last event for this academic year for us, because after this, our next event will only be in October. So we are delighted to be able to have this discussion today and end with this absolutely wonderful book, which I'm happy to say I've read from start to finish. The book under discussion today is Ali Usman Qasmi's recently published, that is 2023, Qaum, Mulk, Saltanat, Citizenship and National Belonging in Pakistan. Here's the book. I'm very delighted to say I possess a copy of it, Stanford University Press, available in paperback. I can't do more to push it. And it has also just recently, I think this weekend, Ali's going to tell us, received the American Institute for Pakistan Studies Best Book Award for 2024. So Ali, congratulations for that. Before I introduce the panelists this afternoon, and we're going to, of course, invite Ali to talk about his book, I'd like to say a very warm welcome to members of the audience who've joined us from across the world, across various time zones. Thank you very much for your interest in our events in this particular book discussion. We have a very, very loyal audience, so thank you very much for that. As always, the chat function on our YouTube channel, as you can see, is enabled. So if you would like to ask a question, then please do type your questions there. And once all the panelists have made their initial remarks and the discussion gets underway, I will pose questions from you at irregular intervals to the panelists. If you'd like to ask a question to a particular panelist, then please mention the panelist or the speaker's name. You're all equally welcome to pose a question to the entire panel, in which case I will ask all of them about it. Now, if this event was being held on site at LSE, then LSE's regulations allow for members of the audience to ask questions without revealing their identity or their name. And in trying to remain as close to the spirit of that, I will not take the names of people who ask questions when I read out the questions. So I hope you understand why I do that. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce members of the panel as well as the author. We have had a brief discussion before we came live on air, so we've decided on an order in which the speakers will speak. And what will happen is I will first invite Ali to present the main arguments of his book. He'll speak for about 10 minutes, after which I will ask each of our expert panelists to make initial comments for about 6 to 8 minutes, and then we will have a discussion. Dr. Ali Usman Qasmi is Associate Professor in History at Lahore University of Management Sciences, that's LUMS, and author of Qaum, Mulk, Saltanat, Citizenship and National Belonging in Pakistan, which is his second book and the book that is being discussed at this afternoon's event. Our first panelist is Dr. Zebunissa Aziz, who is Assistant Professor in History at the University of South Florida in Tampa. And Zebunissa is a historian of global and imperial history of the British Empire and South Asia. Tahir Kamran is Professor and Head of the Department of Liberal Arts at Beaconhouse National University in Lahore, with research interests in democracy, governance, and religious politics in Pakistan. Dr. Zehra Hashmi, our final panelist and speaker, is Assistant Professor in the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and is currently engaged in a historical ethnography of Pakistan's national identity database. Everyone, welcome to this afternoon's event. We are delighted to have you with us. We will begin with Ali presenting the main arguments of his book. Ali, it's your turn now. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarkar, for organizing this event and everyone for attending it. I'm really grateful to see that my mentor and Ustad, Dr. Tahir Kamran, will be speaking about the book, and also very delighted to see our former student Zebunissa as one of the panelists, and Zarah Hashmi, with whom I have interacted, because we both are interested in similar themes. There's kind of like a like a genealogy is here which you can establish. Right. So what I'll try to do is I'll just briefly go through something which I've to summarize the main arguments of the book, which is primarily about the pedagogy of post-colonial nation state and the ideals of equality that it claims to uphold, and how within that potential for radical equality that inheres in the citizenship project, what are the processes whereby there is a possibility of retrieval for reimagining of Pakistan in a different way. So instead of reducing citizenship to a legally recognized membership of the state, I look at the complexity of the processes whereby the post-colonial state formation project is intimately tied with the creation of citizens through various discursive practices, ideological formulations, and pedagogical tools. I describe the process of citizenship making as a form of state formation that involves following out the nation for its excess and semantic ambiguity to make it more amenable and abstract and stabilize its meanings. In other words, while the idea of a sovereign nation spirited the political movement to attain self-rule, Swaraj, independence, or decolonization, the post-colonial state prioritized the sovereign state as a prerequisite for the sustenance of the nation. For this purpose, the post-colonial state adopted a range of policies and performances, such as legislating. Sorry.
You can go a little slow.
Okay, legislating a restrictive legal view of who qualified as a citizen, determining a definite shape, size, and color of national symbols, regulating the temporal cycle for a regimented ordering of national life through public commemorations and celebrations of religious festivals, and forging a master narrative for writing the nation through history. So these are the themes, broadly speaking, which I cover. I've borrowed the title of the book from a single stanza in Pakistan's national anthem, written in Persianized Urdu, roughly translated as a nation, country, and state, Qaum, Mulk, Saltanat. The longer vernacular histories of these terms embody various meanings that do not necessarily cohere with the ones emphasized in the anthem. A summary description of my project would be that it studies the lack of correspondence between the sedimented meanings of these terms and the post-colonial state's attempts at stabilizing the meaning of Qaum as a Pakistani nation, defined in a particular manner, a mulk that sustains it, and a sultanate of Islam. Now, primarily, I'm looking at this triangulation of state, nation, and citizen, as evident from the title. And to borrow from Hannah Arendt, rights are based on sameness, assembling various communities as a nation, and also on difference to ensure equality between said communities. In the name of sovereignty and nationhood, the post-colonial state seeks to flatten that difference to create a homogenized citizenry, and yet it holds on to the affective power of the national symbol, the archetype, imagining a glorious past to animate the disenchanted present. Managing affective, pre-critical organic community bonds and their symbols and metaphors is at the heart of state-making projects. The flattening of differences refuse to recognize the minority types and whatever does not fit into the imagined national type, dealing with them through eradication or at best liberal assimilation with a corresponding set of differential rights, layered forms of citizenship, and special constitutional categories. When the Mozambican revolutionary Samora Machel says that the tribe must die for the nation to live, Mahmoud Mamdani interprets it as a message that every potential source of competing identity had to be cleansed in order to homogenize the nation. In other words, this flattening is part of national homogenization, going against the Arendtian idea of establishing artificial equality to constitute the basic condition of both action and speech, wherein individuals can realize their humanity through public action and speech. So much of what I do is try to chart that history as to how this abortive or aspiring even homogenization project of the state unfolds, and the need for historicization as a retrieval. And I borrow from Mamdani and his argument for an intricate engagement with history. What I take from Mamdani's work is his idea of historicization as a praxis of undoing, and thus in this book, I analyze the constituent elements of the Qaum and its shifting boundaries and changing valuational emphasis, as well as the contingencies of their making. I chronicle the nation state's abortive aspirational march towards coherence, that always falls apart at the seams and perhaps even at the core. Through such historicization, it is probably possible to efface the citizen-nation difference. The premise of equality enshrined in the citizenship ideal can be retrieved from its radical history and from the nation's symbolic repertoires of anti-colonial resistance and its vibrant autochthonous discourses around liberty, freedom, and sovereignty. Now, for this process of retrieval and historicization, one should ideally look at these so-called foundational moments of the post-colonial movement in which these discussions took place. In case of Pakistan, one cannot sort of point to a single foundational moment, which, let's say, in case of India, can be the adoption of the constitution and the formation of the Indian Republic. Perhaps was that kind of a foundational moment, but in Pakistan, it's difficult to see that kind of a moment, and that is why in this book, as you would see, there is like a kind of like a back and forth. I mostly focus on the period from 1947 to 1956 and take 56 as a cutoff point because that's when the first constitution was adopted. But then it's not that I limit myself to 1956, although I argue that it's basically during the 1950s that much of discussion about democracy, federation, ethnicity, nationalism, citizenship took place, and this is where mostly that I focus my attention. But still, there are moments which are important. There are legislative pieces which are important, and it might sound cliched, but Jinnah's speech of 11th August 1947 is one key foundational moment. For Jinnah, the basis for equality must be sought in the language of the law. Jinnah saw in the post-colonial movement the first real instantiation of the social contract described by Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. In this moment that Jinnah saw as of world historical significance, there was an urgency for exploring a new social contract to build a state that recognized difference but accepted the validity of political equality. No one better than Jinnah himself, a great component of the two-nation theory, realized that his statement nullified the Muslim-Hindu difference that served as the very basis for the newly established state. For Jinnah, the theory had become redundant at the precise moment of its creation. But in saying so, Jinnah was not claiming freedom from religion, but rather freedom to practice religion in a manner that allowed communities their public religious identities while ensuring their political equality as citizens. Equality formed the central plank of Jinnah's vision for organizing the new political community in the newly established state of Pakistan. That alone, he realized, could eradicate distinctions like majority and minority, believer and non-believer, Muslim and Hindu, citizen and national. As one of the most important events in Pakistan's history, the liberal potential of Jinnah's speech has never been lost on those aspiring for equality in the new state. No matter which term one uses, like secularism, pluralism, or egalitarianism, the emphasis has always been on equality as the basis for being Pakistani and as a marker for acceptance of difference. Now, that is kind of like a premise which is in that post-colonial movement. So that premise is retrievable, whether from the larger Pakistan project, whether from Jinnah's prosaic constitutional theory or Iqbal's metaphysical language of poetry. It shows how the historicization of the nation state can yield rich dividends in striving towards equality, effacing the citizen-nation divide, and undermining the settler colonial forms of power exercised by the post-colonial state. But this endeavor must start by exploring the citizen-nation divide and the nature of the assemblage called the post-colonial state. This is what I set out to do in this book. I describe what happened to the nation and show how the citizen was discursively created and mediated through historical, cultural, and religious practices of power and pedagogy. For this purpose, I trace the making of the label citizen and its inscription through state violence and legislative power over citizenship, and also in attempts to create a sense of belonging and affect through such spectacular acts as festivals. In the creation and recreation of the state through everyday practices, as well as in its subversion, a veritable daily plebiscite, as Ernest Renan calls it, the post-colonial state, I argue, draws on the metaphor of Qaum to incite a transformative aspiration towards majoritarian nationhood, but it empties the metaphor of its richness, plurality, and fluidity of meaning. In this fashion, to borrow from Shirupa Roy's work, The state is nationalized and the nation is institutionalized. In conclusion, this book is about those mediating practices through which the post-colonial state sought to cultivate a sense of being Pakistani, the constituent elements of such an identity, and the various ways in which citizens contested it, contributed towards it, or engaged in multiple other ways to ensure that it remains an abortive project, always in the state of becoming. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to your time. I'm sure we will come back to you for multiple of reasons, and you will have chances to perhaps give also some illustrations of the wonderful examples and anecdotal bits that comprise your very, very readable book. Zebunissa Aziz is our speaker next. Dr. Zebunissa Aziz is assistant professor in history at the University of South Florida in Tampa and historian of global and imperial history of the British Empire and South Asia. Please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarkar. Thank you to everyone for being here. It's particularly a pleasure for me as an alumni and also like a mentee of Dr. Qasmi. So this is a very, this is an honor to be here. Qaum Mulk Saltanat is a rich, erudite, and really path-breaking work on the construction of post-colonial Pakistan. With that said, now I'll just follow with 7 minutes of footnote. It's a fantastic book. South Asian history for far too long usually ends in 1947 with the tragedy and horror of the partition. This was particularly in the case of Pakistan, and there are several reasons for this, some of which Dr. Qasmi discusses in the introduction and of the book. But chief among these is, of course, the political context of Pakistan. The Pakistani military establishment particularly carefully guards narratives about the country, both its past as well as its present and future. It does not really have, as a society, Pakistan does not have freedom of speech, and critiques, challenges, and investigations are closely monitored, particularly when they are done so in Urdu. The Pakistani public universities, which, as Pakistani historians have shown, were bastions of resistance, have systematically and deliberately been culled of progressive elements. And with the new liberalization of the state and our economy, investment in education generally and in the humanities particularly has dwindled dramatically. This is the context with which I wanted to start, and it's this context that makes this book and Qasmi's achievement all the more special. He has brought together an astonishing number of little known and, more importantly, little used archives, both public and private, in Pakistan. Reading the book, one repeatedly gets this sense of a network and ecosystem of librarians, booksellers, archivists, and collectors in the country who have quietly kept this rich record, often with no help from public or private sectors. And so this book showcases not only the author's intellectual prowess and his capacities, of course, as a master historian and writer, but I think it's also important to say that it's a testament to his ability to collaborate and really build community with other scholars and practitioners. So now to some substantive remarks about the book. All nations, as we know, are imagined, but some need to be imagined more than others. And this book shows us that Pakistan is an example of the latter. If you grow up in Pakistan like I did, the Pakistan story as it is told in schools, in songs, in historical TV dramas and films and magazines, so on and so forth, focuses on the attainment of azadi, freedom. A process that was supposedly fought for not just under the British, but had been really going on perhaps even for hundreds of years, really from medieval, since medieval India, and culminates and crescendos in August 14th, 1947. Of course, the historical record, as historians have told us, is on the contrary. We know well that the Pakistan project comes at a very late stage in the anti-colonial struggle in British India and gains political prominence even later. Partition, many historians argue, including myself, that it was not considered a serious possibility even after the Second World War. Indeed, Jinnah used it, many argue and show, as a sort of bargaining chip to gain political leverage in a united, federated India. And particularly the mass migration and that led to the death and dispossession of millions of people that happened in the partition was never imagined by those who ultimately took responsibility for it. But this book starts from the day after. A class of political elite with the Muslim League, many members of that, and as well as its allies and affiliates, were now in possession of a state for which they had neither prepared nor planned. When refugees arrived, as many satirists have noted, they often asked, where is Pakistan? And were sort of surprised when you say that it really comprised of the cities and provinces that had existed and preceded this new state for hundreds of years. So statesmen, administrators, bureaucrats, thus set out to, quote unquote, create this new country while also giving it a historical past. This book details in really wonderfully in this very spirited and animated narrative in which the means through which they did so, but also the troubles and contradictions and challenges they ran into. And they ran into many challenges. They had to answer, as we saw in the introduction, at big questions, right? Who is a citizen and who is a national? And whose homeland is this anyway? Now, there was some degree of consensus that Pakistan was to be a Muslim homeland, but one had to determine what that would mean for non-Muslims, as Dr. Qasmi was just saying. On the one hand, as many on the right said, Pakistan was made in the name of Islam. After all, it was said, Pakistan ka matlab kya, la ilaha illallah. So its Islamic character, it would make sense, had to take precedence over anything else. On the other hand, there were those, including Jinnah himself, who said that actually Pakistan was made to protect a minority population and to ensure a kind of secularism which the Muslim League had claimed the Congress could never deliver in united India. This argument, however, did not win, but it is important to remember it. It is important to remember it because there is a gap between the idea of the Muslim homeland before 1947 and the practical making of a Muslim homeland post-1947. When I was reading the book, I realized, like many settler colonial regimes, the state had to first create a sort of tabula rasa on which to create Pakistan. The Muslim homeland did not exist. It was created after 1947 through citizenship laws, through the constitution, and through the creation of cultural artifacts, including state archives and state histories. It was done through renaming cities, through removing statues, through creating new heroes and forgetting other. The country was taken away discursively and literally, systematically from its minority populations, particularly Hindus, Sikhs, and this Christian community. However, the state was also constantly faced with another set, perhaps even more difficult set of questions, which was, who is a Muslim and what is Islam? One of the key strengths of this book, which really breathes new life to a story of dispossession and ostracization that may be familiar to many Pakistanis, is the exploration of this particular irony. How do you reify faith in a modern state, in a modern post-colonial state in the 20th century? How do you do that without ceding an enormous amount of power to clerics and clergy? Over time, the category of Muslim has become more and more limited, as Dr. Qasmi has also shown in his earlier work, due to the lobbying of the religious right precisely on this basis. And the state had to embrace its members. This otherization has led to the exclusion of Ahmadis, one of the most targeted and oppressed communities in the country. And now, in the 21st century, it has now extended to other minority sects, including the Shia community in Pakistan. But this work also implies an enormous and important question. Can there be sovereignty based on religion in the modern world and do so legitimately? How does sovereignty demanded on religious authority and religious texts function quite literally on a day-to-day basis in a disenchanted world? The chapter on which was one of my favorites on the sighting of the moon for Eid al-Fitr and the debate on the future of the Ruwayat Halal Committee is precisely exemplifies this problem. Now, I would hope that the head of the committee, Mufti Munir Rahman Saab, knows how to use a phone and I can hope that he knows that people can now use their phone to simply locate the moon and they don't need him to announce it every time Ramzan comes along. But he understands that this ritual, like all Islamic rituals associated with the state, are precisely what makes the state Islamic. That without them, without their performance, even despite the fact that over 95% of the country is recognizes itself as Muslim, the state will not remain so. And that the religious authority of the state or the religious authority of the clergy would lose then political authority. Now, in summation, we can ask, what was the project successful? Enormously. But this has always been a Pyrrhic victory. It has not brought stability or lasting legitimacy. The areas that became Pakistan were not tabula rasa, and people have reminded the state of that. The book shows that people take issue with the state's dictation. They do not take it sitting down, whether it was the national anthem or the national dress. Despite its insistence on separation from India, United India's history and culture impinge on a majority of Pakistanis' lives. And when the state has overestimated its abilities and chosen to erase or diminish entire cultures, such as a millennia of Bengali history, it has to face crisis, and ultimately, despite the use of incredible genocidal violence, has had to face loss. So I'll just end with a few questions in the last few seconds I have. I would love to know, how much would you agree with Faisal Devji's idea that this country, Pakistan, was insufficiently imagined? And how far can we say now that it was that the Pakistani project of creating this Qaum was successful? And in reading the book, I was also kind of reminded of construction and erasure and comparative terms, thinking about Israel, thinking about in the Modi's India and the idea of erasure and history. And I was thinking what you would think about the rise of resistance against those projects, as well as continued resistance within Pakistan, what are the prospects of Pakistaniyat in the 21st century and of Pakistani nationalism? So it's a big question, but it will concluding looking forward. Thank you so much. And once again, many, many congratulations, and thank you for your work.
Thank you very much. To be absolutely fair to Ali, he did say his book ends in 1956, so you can't really ask him about 2024, but we'll still give him a chance. Tahir Kamran is professor and head of the Department of Liberal Arts. Ali, shall we just go through all the initial comments first, and then you'll have the chance to come back and then we'll have a discussion. Yeah, I think that might be better also for the audience to hear of an initial set of remarks, if that's fine. Our next speaker is Tahir Kamran, who's professor and head of the Department of Liberal Arts at Beaconhouse National University in Lahore, with research interests in democracy, governance, and religious politics in Pakistan. I'm delighted to have Tahir with us. It's a long, long time ago that I met him. I can't even remember, but it's probably 2000 or 1999 or something like this. And we have been friends since then. Tahir, welcome. And also, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Nilanjan. It was really nice seeing you after so many years. And many congratulations to His Excellency, my dear friend and once my student, Ali Usman Qasmi. I call him His Excellency as his pet name to me, out of love. So many congratulations on that prize that you've won. I didn't know about it before. So when you'll come back to Lahore, we will celebrate, and I'll throw a dinner in your honor. That is really remarkable, because that's the third book that Ali Usman Qasmi has produced. The second one was, came out of the discussion that we had in Lahore and in London and Cambridge, where I spent 5 years. And the whole rubric and the whole discursive components of the book I was very well aware of. So, but this book just amazed me because of its scope and the rigor that it carries. Really, its introduction is so rigorous, and similarly the first chapter. So I think it's a path-breaking work, and it reminded me the works of great Christopher Bailey, the birth of the modern word. Because what he has done is he has synthesized a wide array of archival material with theoretical frameworks, picked up from various from Laklau to Derrida to Partha Chatterjee and so on and so forth. So it's a very skillful expression of a historian. But now the real thing is, which I will ask Ali Usman Qasmi to really comment on that. Was it a book of history? You know, it's a methodological problem. Are we writing history nowadays? You know, or is anthropology or sociology combined, and along with that, bit of a literary theory? So, because it starts from 40s and it ends at 1956, as the author said. So it's more of a synchronic uh, argument than diachronic. So without diachrony, how can we say that we're historians? So are we writing? You know, Faisal Devji, my previous the Zebunissa Aziz said that, you know, he talked about Pakistan as insufficiently imagined. Well, it was in fact the author of Satanic Verses, who for the first time said about Pakistan that it's insufficiently imagined, and Dhulupala then took it up and he wrote a whole book on that, you know, rather a research paper on that. But Faisal Devji himself, does he write history? So that's a question. I don't know really. I want your comment. Because when I'm reading Joy Chatterjee's recent book, you know, that is history, you know. But what about these books with ordinarily long introductions, full of mouthful words and theories put together? So they exist in a moment. That moment does not long into minutes or hours or days and years. So that is the real problem with me. So then belonging, you know, that's very interesting argument that Dr. Ali Usman Qasmi poses. Uh, India had no such problem because India existed before 15th of August 1947. Pakistan did not exist on 13th of August 1947. All of a sudden, out of the blue, there was a state. So that state needed to have some antecedent, some perspective, geographical, historical, cultural. And from all these three comes this discursive category that we call belonging. And belonging was one instrument of homogenization, I think, because there was a dress code, there was a language, there were other signifiers, there was other symbols. So all those symbols, they had the point of origin from mainland northern India. So we are embracing that belonging, the sense of belonging, that was emanated from mainland northern India, from where we just walked out. We tried to establish a separate homeland. So this separatism had its point of origin somewhere in India. So we excluded ourselves, and we are trying to build our identity and sense of belonging, which is rooted in the land from where we're trying to walk away. So that's a very problematic sort of a formulation, and I think we must address this. And still, in Pakistan, there is a confusion, there's ambiguity, ambivalence about culture. If you read Hafiz Mahmood Shirani, as Usman Qasmi is well aware of Hafiz Mahmood Shirani being a wonderful scholar, he says that Urdu was produced in Punjab. So that is highly contested. But then, you know, Urdu has been imposed at the expense of Punjabi in Punjab. So this whole sense of belonging, has displaced the original autochthonous formulations, whether those are epistemic, cultural, or political. So that is something that needed to be addressed. And then, so far as dress code, how come Abul Kalam Azad's dress code was different from whatever Ali Usman Qasmi enumerates in his chapter? That, well, this is what, there was a topi, there was a echkan, there was a churidar pajama and all this. So all this was worn by Abul Kalam Azad, and one of the prime ministers of India, and that I'm forgetting the name of, he was the finance minister of Rajiv Gandhi's government, and later on he became prime minister for short while. So then, His Excellency, you must answer my this question, that in this whole debate about belonging and symbols, East Bengal was totally excluded from the discussion, because I didn't find any mention of East Pakistan. Whenever there was a discussion happening between Hussain Ahmad Madni and Allama Iqbal. Iqbal was from Punjab, and Hussain Ahmad Madni was from UP. Saharanpur, Darul Uloom Deoband being his alma mater. So it means that we had excluded East Bengal right from the very beginning, right from the very outset. And the whole debate of this belonging and the symbols that we try to come up with, and there's an interesting note, is that during the initial days of Pakistan, this Bengali, on a currency note of Pakistan, there was no mention or no inscription in Bengali. It was later on when Bengalis protested, this happened. So when we talk about Pakistan as imagined community or imagined nation, so I 100% agree with Dr. Qasmi. I read it between the lines, and it was quite evidently expressed at some point also, that it was founded before it was imagined. It was founded and then imagined. So that is what is the uniqueness of Pakistan. So then, this point, which is the last point that I'll be making, is that homogenization. There's a wonderful way to express our concern about Pakistan, homogenization. But when homogenization was asserted, that homogenization came through the tools of exclusion, be it Ahmadis or Shias or Bengalis, or now Blochis, and now rural Sindhis. So this homogenization is being articulated through the tools of exclusion. So I think that is the lesson that I have taken from Ali Usman Qasmi's book, and that confirms my own conclusions that I have drawn over a period of time in my reading and in my writing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tahir. That's a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Dr. Zehra Hashmi, who is Assistant Professor in the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and is currently engaged in a historical ethnography of Pakistan's national identity database. Zehra, welcome, and you have the floor now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Perfect, thank you. I'll start with saying that I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation. It was such a pleasure to read this book, and it's a book that really, I think, frames the field, of course, the field of Pakistani history, but also beyond. It was especially generative for me for thinking very broadly about the meaning of citizenship and belonging in post-colonial contexts, and how this came to be defined. So the first set of thoughts I have are around the book's theorization of citizenship in Pakistan. And I have to say that this is, even as somebody who works on the National Identity Database, the question of citizenship in Pakistan is incredibly difficult and complex. So it's incredible that Dr. Qasmi took it on in this way. So I'm thinking particularly about the relationship between the nature of citizenship in post-colonial contexts and the type of documentary regimes we see, particularly identity documents for citizens. And the introduction gets into that, but chapter 1 really gets into that in a lot of detail. So as Dr. Qasmi shows in the introduction, in Europe, the rights-bearing individual, the individual citizen, emerges in this move from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, from community to society, from status to contract. And so we see this shift towards contractual relations. This is how it's been theorized. And here the individual is basically an already existing individual, a rights-bearing subject in liberal theory, who comes into contract then with other individuals and forms society, and the state governs these relations. The process in South Asia, especially if we think through the genealogy of the individual citizen from colonialism onwards, but even before, how it could be created and identified, both in India and Pakistan at the very least, looks very, very different. And Qaum Mulk Saltanat really shows us that. In particular, to some extent, it shows that the individual continues to be embedded within kinship networks, within religious community, because of the ways, in a lot of ways, but especially because of the ways that documentary citizenship ends up working. As you show, I was hoping, Ali, that you could situate the kinds of documentary regimes we see in Pakistan, especially during this earlier period that you describe in chapter 1, and their relationship to what you term the ideational basis of nationhood, that is Muslim Qawmiyat. So what is the exact relationship between what ends up happening in terms of documentary citizenship in this early period and this broader project of creating a Muslim Qaum? And do you see a coherence in the form of these, in the kinds of documents and bureaucratic practices that emerge in these early years of Pakistani statehood? Do they correspond pretty directly to Muslim Qaum, or is it primarily actually a set of contradictions? In other words, how do these documentary practices in the early years of statecraft, which effectively confer citizenship, sit alongside this broader concept or ideal of citizenship, particularly given the contradictions within Pakistani law and its enactment in these early years? So where do these contradictions and some degree of coherence, where does that basically leave us with the concept of citizenship as a whole? Do we need something different, perhaps, to describe what's going on in Pakistan during this time and onwards, really? And if so, what might that be? And part of the reason I ask this is because, as you know, we actually met in the National Archives at early on in my archival fieldwork, where we were both looking at the citizenship section in the Interior Ministry files. So I read through many of the same cases that you write about. And one of the things that struck me was that, yes, as you say, citizenship came to be increasingly restricted around this notion of Muslim homeland and religious identity. But I was also struck by the extent to which the adjudication of citizenship was, and I would argue still is, imbricated within this floating signifier of securitization and assessment of risk. And we continue to, of course, see this in the way that citizenship is acquired and stripped through the Nadra identity card and its blocking and all of the discourses around it. So it's not just that there was an ideal of liberal citizenship over here and then its delimitation on the other side. Rather, what citizenship even is, who a citizen is, was defined impromptu, spontaneously alongside these assessments of security and risk. So you mentioned this on page 76, you quote the Interior Officer Hamiduddin Ahmed, who sees Hindu migration into East Pakistan, which is really Hindu return to East Pakistan, as a potential Indian conspiracy. But I'd love to get more of your thoughts and a sense of how you how you see the extent to which citizenship, as opposed to in a liberal universal form, is actually constructed through risk, which is why documentary practices are so key for establishing citizenship in Pakistan, not just evidencing it. So not just saying this is citizenship and here's a person who has it, but actually establishing it because they serve as a technology for mitigating risk. So I bring up risk not just as the sort of local term, native term that these bureaucrats use, but also as an analytic, because I wonder if it troubles the idea of primarily religious identity that was the exclusionary mode in which citizenship was delimited. Of course, there's a difference nonetheless between who's seen more likely to be a spy or a risk, right? A Hindu or a Muslim, especially in this period. But I do wonder if the fact that the debates on citizenship and the actual enactment of the policies were all taking place within this historical context of mass displacement, upheaval, and the simultaneous construction of what Wazir Zamindar calls the internal border and frontier between India and Pakistan, that eventually becomes a national border. Thus, the understanding of who a citizen is and who belongs becomes really intimately connected to a condition of insecurity, essentially. So one of the reasons, again, that I emphasize this is because of the Afghan issue, which emerges later, but really not that much later. Like as early as the early 1960s, it's the Durand Line is already a really major issue for the Pakistani state, and the movement of Afghans across that border, even though they are Muslims and have in fact lived in parts of Pakistan, is still an issue. So I don't want to also say that I don't want to exceptionalize the historical conditions under which Pakistan was created, because this is in fact what post-colonial processes of decolonization look like. They're often accompanied by re-territorialization, maybe not always as profound a violence as the partition created. Neither do I want to imply that the form that citizenship took in Pakistan was inevitable because of these historical circumstances, because you show us in the debates that in fact it was quite the opposite. Rather, I just want to invite you to reflect on how we can actually reconceptualize citizenship through its post-colonial context. So not that it's solely written with contradictions, that it's unable to live up to its liberal form, but as a distinct entity altogether with a different set of functions that may or may not have emancipatory potential. So yeah, maybe I'll have a whole lot of other questions, which is, I think, just a testament to how wonderful and generative and productive this book was. But I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for your initial comments. And no doubt, Zehra, that we will have time later on to come back to some other questions. But I think it is fair to say that we have given Ali a long list of things to talk about now. And I have dutifully been taking notes, just to announce that, if anyone from the members of the audience want to ask a question, you're able to ask them now by typing it in the chat box. Ali, how are you going to deal with this? Do you want to take a few questions that are similar together? I mean, you're welcome to speak to a group of questions, or you're welcome to take it whichever way. But if you keep your responses brief and direct, then we can have another set of discussions, etc. Yeah. Do you want to start? Please speak.
Yes. So I'll go by the order of speakers in which they put questions. And thank you so much for your very thoughtful reading of my work and for these very exciting questions. And starting with what Dr. Zebunissa Aziz said, and she rightly understands the kind of because she's worked so much in Pakistani archives about this kind of critical mass which is emerging, especially among Pakistani historians, and which is a great kind of a departure from the way it used to be, as Arshad Jalal famously called it, intellectual wasteland. So it's really refreshing to have these kind of conversations taking place among Pakistani scholars about issues relating to Pakistan and the wider region. So I think it's about the Devji conceptualization of Pakistan as insufficiently imagined. I tend to sort of differ with that, and because I think there is enough discussion evidence to show that people were approaching the idea of Pakistan in multiple ways, and hence the kind of contestation as to what actually it meant whether it was meant to be an Islamic state, a Muslim state, theocracy, a democracy, a liberal modern Islamic state, so on and so forth. And also, she also, hinted at, she talked about like how there was an idea of Muslim homeland prior to 47 and after 47. And this is, I think, this is something which I do take up. I do not develop it any further, but one of the reasons why I try to provide a longer history of Muslim Qaum as a metaphor is precisely meant to do that. As to how, if we locate it in that kind of like with the help of literary theory, using as I was trying to do, using Shamsul Rahman Farooqi's work, it can open up other ways of looking at other histories, possible histories of Muslim presence in South Asia, especially in the pre-modern period, and then to see the transition as it takes place into the colonial and then the post-colonial moment. The question about the prospects of Pakistaniyat in the 21st century, I would say, naively perhaps, that I thought of, there is a certain kind of like an emergence of a constitutional patriotism emerging in Pakistan, where diverse political actors rallying around the constitution to petition certain rights from the state based on the provisions of the constitution, as whether they were like Aurat March, Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, and all sorts of other leftist feminist groups and organizations. But I have to say that what we have seen, what we have witnessed over the past 2 years, the kind of most terrible autocratic, authoritarian clampdown and the almost like abolition of democracy in the country, it puts, I think, the whole project back by many decades, if not sort of like impossible to proceed in any positive direction at all. So here's that. Professor Kamran, it's it was to say that if it's a book of history or it's let's not. I think it's categories in that sense, as we know, they're not very important. Whether it's in terms of disciplinary bounds, it's meant to be trying to be speaking about a kind of like intellectual history of Pakistan. And I'm not a textualist in that sense. So this, synchronic or diachronic kind of like a binary would make it impossible in some way as to, if for any kind of like the way you put it, for any kind of a study which is time bound, which is about looking at a specific kind of a time period existing in the moment, as you put it, it would be discarded, right? So that's why. For me, as a historian, it is important to be able to provide the context in which to read a certain kind of an archive, and to enhance. This is where I think the historian's craft is important, that we are not sort of like then bound in that, frozen in that moment, and that we are able to sort of like zoom out and look at the broader picture for a fuller, better understanding of what we are encountering in the archive. So this is perhaps the way I would explain my method. But thank you. You have been incredibly generous in your comments and your critique about belonging. And I would have a slight disagreement. I would not agree that India existed prior to 15th August. I don't think India. I think India also didn't exist in that form or sense prior to 15th August. So like really it's like the birth of two new kinds of nation states. Yes, I mean, it's a very different kind of legacy that they both inherit democratically, historically, and in so many other ways as well. And because of this different legacy, the future trajectory hence was also different in both cases. Also, the belonging, by belonging, it's not necessarily referring to a belonging to the nation state as such, but the affective ways or notions through which people could imagine an emotive sense of a social community, whether it was organized around religion, nationality, region, city, And hence, I think in your comments, actually, it points out, it sort of like it makes it possible to understand why this was not that this could not happen, right? That if the statist kind of like project was North India centric, if the state imposition was of a kind of like this trinity of Urdu, Islam, and Muslim, and hence making it impossible for this kind of like an affective mode of belonging to exist. So I think we kind of like have an agreement in this regard. And you're referring to like East Bengal being excluded from discussions. Yes, this is true in the sense that like why is it that does not figure prominently when it comes to a cultural imagining of the Muslim Qaum, especially in the pre-47 period. We know from the works of other scholars like Naidesh Bosch and others, like how it was it's not as if that this sense was lacking there. In fact, it was perhaps more culturally vibrant in intellectual discussions taking place in East Bengal. In my work, I do point out the post-47 period as to how Bengali leaders were very vocal. In fact, the ones who were and hence were very successful in centering, these Bengali voices, and through various means and measures. For instance, and demanding that I'm forgetting the name of the Bengali poet right now, that he be considered at par with Iqbal, for instance, so that there should be a national holiday in his honor.
Nazrul
Islam. Thank you so much. Right. So in these the different kinds of ways in which the Bengali voices, when it comes to culture, language, and there's a different debate altogether when it comes to the role of religion in the state, in which they very, very forcefully participated. Dr. Hashmi, thank you so much. These are fantastic questions, and I must admit, again, of the limitations of my work, and this is where I think your contribution is going to be incredibly important, because it looks at all these different ways in which these documentary regimes, techniques of surveillance have been, as they have evolved over a period of time, with a much more careful reading of especially the legal archive, court cases, and so on and so forth. I have limited myself to looking at this one particular aspect of citizenship as it is being debated, centered around the massive displacement and the refugee crisis following partition. Right. So for me, the basic sort of like lens through which to look at citizenship question, or its liberal pretense or universalism, and the way it falls short of that premise, is entirely based on, or mostly based on that particular event. I mean, I do talk about, especially in its formative phase and when it was being discussed, as to how the law encountered difficulties accommodating or conceptualizing or dealing with those who would fall out of the normative category of being a citizen, whether it was an Afghan, whether it was a tribal, whether it was an Irani living in British India, or a diaspora, and all sorts of different categories. But when it comes to documentary regimes, I think I would say Wazira Zamidar has done a fantastic job already, especially when it comes to looking at these India-specific passports or emergency certificates. But if the question is, and this is where I'll also add and re-emphasize that for her and for me as well, I think it's the individual's connection with kinship and social is the real sort of like route through which citizenship or legal claim, a legal and an affective or a national claim is being made. And right, and this is what I'm more interested in. This is where I want to invest more of my time. So obviously, I think as you rightly pointed out, the category of risk or securitization is very key, and it's very early on. It gets mentioned, especially when it comes to the movement of Afghan tribes on both sides, and that is a perennial feature, right? So it is a limitation of my work that I'm not going into that detail. Like I said, I'm looking at mostly the 1950s, especially when it comes to citizenship, and I'm mostly looking at it from the perspective of a partition and how it impacts refugees or creates a special category of refugees. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot more which needs to be done, especially when it comes to how courts have decided on these different kind of like citizenship cases, especially when it comes to Pashtun, Baloch, and tribal areas, right? So, and lastly, it's I've been talking about, you know, this conformity to the Muslim nation or the internal contradictions, and this is where I think this is the reason why I think, you know, this distinction along the lines of like whether these were pragmatic reasons for exclusion or inclusion, or ideological reasons for exclusion or inclusion, makes sense, because it helps sort of like pick this, you know, or challenge this kind of like an overarching kind of like an ideological framework, as if it's all being done under the banner of Islam or some higher purpose, which is not truly the case. You know, and yeah, like, as you've said, you know, so taking into account all these different kinds of contradictions, and gaps and procedures and techniques. So there is a need for a theorization of this distinct entity of post-colonial citizenship, especially of a post-colonial citizenship, which perhaps, you know, your work will contribute towards. Thank you once again, all of you.
Thank you very much. We do have some time to you know, have more of a conversation, but if I may just ask a few questions. One is, there was a question that I think Zebunissa had asked, which you didn't answer. It's fine if you don't want to answer it right now, but the question was, can there be sovereignty based on religion? That was the question that had been asked, just in case you want to. I'm going to ask you two questions and then we can come back again. Part of it relates to what Zehra was saying, part of it relates to what Tahir was saying, it's also about Zebunissa, because it has to do with archives. My own interest is in the 14th century, where neither or any of these entities that all of you are talking about actually existed in their current forms. So that's that. My question, the first one I want to ask you, Ali, takes off from what Zehra said and what you just responded to just now, which is, on the spectrum of belonging, which is in many ways the intangible that holds and anchors the legal status of citizenship. On that spectrum, where or how does, on the one hand, the question of exclusion and the statist attempts at homogenization sit so that the two can be put on the same spectrum, where as part of the same spectrum is also that the asserted self-exclusion of what was East Pakistan, it was their own self-exclusion from the imagination, let's call it that for the moment. Where do these all sit in your mind on the spectrum of belonging and citizenship? Do you harmonize them? Do you just see them as separate blocks? Do you know, where is it? Because very palpably present in all this is the statist attempt at homogenization, which up to a point is not sinful, because states need to have a certain you know, the whole debate that is going on in England at the moment over whether multiculturalism, you know, whether uniculturalism should be favored over multiculturalism. You know? So there are a certain set of British values that all of us adhere to. So you know, there is this debate. So I just wanted to know where you thought in your mind on this spectrum of belonging and citizenship, all these things sit one after the other, which is exclusion on the basis of risk, attempts at homogenization, the example of Punjabi and Urdu that Tahir gave, for instance, and the affirmative self-exclusion of one unit of the imagined community.
Yes, thank you. These are very thought-provoking questions. Sorry, I missed Zebunissa's earlier question about sovereignty based on religion. I mean, it's I think for me it's more about trying to analyze these modalities of power, and as to how it becomes kind of like an attempt at these competing attempts at exercising that sovereign power, right? So if that sovereign power is being exercised, if the idea is that sovereign power, the state is going to exercise that sovereign power, in the modern language of religion, it is and that was the project, more specifically from 1960s onwards. So the exercising of sovereign power using that modern language of religion required that control over religious discourse, and hence this is where the state ended up ceding a lot of its own power to the religio-political parties and ulama, right? So this is these kind of like questions, these modalities of power, and this competing kind of like claims to the modern language of religion as a sovereign power. This is what I'm interested in, and how it has led to what Saadia Saeed would say, the desecularization of Pakistani state structure, or law, and so on and so forth. Okay. Secondly, about the spectrum of belonging, and there is this the question of exclusion based on risk, and the statist attempts at homogenization. So the again, like I said, these are questions which are which can be approached in 2-3 different ways, right? So there's one, like I've said, which is just to look at it from the perspective of a special event called partition, which required managing these migrant bodies, especially during the 1950s and the 1960s, based on a qualifying criteria of who is a Muslim and who is not. And then after a certain, and even there too, the question of risk comes into play, becomes important, as we see that the state itself is reluctant to admit even Muslims, because they think that they might be sort of like working for the Indian state. Then there is the question of risk, which comes to the quote unquote frontier regions, and this is where I think a more specialized kind of like study is required, because the archive there, the legal archive especially there, is immense, and it has changed so dramatically from 1979 onwards with the onset of Afghan crisis, Afghan refugee crisis, right? So it's so I'll leave that. I do not think that I'm qualified to answer that. This is precisely Dr. Hashmi's work, and she is more qualified and experienced to answer that. But it's I'll say one thing, and which is to say about the kind of like the bureaucratization of practice, whereby where I mean, I would say that it is the rule making of it. It sort of like in many ways it sort of like overcomes or is dismissive of so many other sort of like whether it comes to factors of risk or ideology or and so on and so forth, because we see that in the bureaucratic archive as to how one of the major anxieties that the section officers are facing is that if we apply this exception in case of Sindh, it will have to be universally applicable. It have to be applicable in case of Bengal as well, right? And whereas in Bengal, the bureaucrat or the section officer is willing to accept the Hindu's right to citizenship as more sort of like inalienable as compared to that of the Punjabi Hindu or the Sindhi Hindu, right? So there are what I'm trying to say is that there is part of that anxiety stems from the very bureaucratic rule making and sticking to the book, when it comes to exercising or implementing those rules and those laws, right? So it's I think through within this kind of like bureaucratic rule making and practice that one can sort of like find the answer to your question.
I'm going to ask all of you to come back with more thoughts just now, but I am going to Ali, ask you one more question before I fall silent. But I think it was Zehra who mentioned the Durand line when you were speaking, and I just thought I'd tell you that where I look at it from the 14th century, you would have traders, because that's that side of the border of whether you want to call it a sultanate or an empire. I mean, part of our problem is also the terminologies that we are using in English and the images that they instantly and unconsciously conjure in our minds. But let's call it sultanate. And it also is a title that you use, the word that you use in the title of your book. You would have Mongol traders who traded across territorial boundaries, bearing in mind over here, please, that Mongols are not necessarily Muslims at this time. You would have Mongol traders who would wear pieces of thread around their neck with a locket, a terracotta locket, which was called a paitsu. And they would simply, when they crossed the border, they'd simply turn it round and wear the other side. That simply allowed them to travel across borders. It was like a passport with a visa on it, literally. And then when they would go back, they would turn it around again. So, one of the very interesting things about studying that part of the world is the historical legacy of what was inherited geopolitically, linguistically, culturally, etc. So all of which I am going to now pose a history question to you, because I can't let you go without asking that. Tahir said, and these are his words because I wrote it down, that Pakistan was founded before it was imagined. Yeah, and you, of course, delve in it in a lot of detail. Where in this idea, and we are not getting into the minutiae of imagined communities and et cetera, but more historically speaking, where in this larger scheme of ideas is, say, a book like Rahmat Ali's book on Pakistan, which is 1935, okay, which I can't recall off the top of my head, but actually towards the beginning has chapters on flora and fauna of Pakistan. And you know the book I'm talking about, because there is a narrative that comes into play post 1947 and later on in school textbooks in Pakistan about, a genealogy of the nation, as it were. And why is it that, say, a book like Rahmat Ali's is not considered as part of the imagination of Pakistan in the longer scheme of things?
I think there is Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. In that sense, Chaudhry Rahmat Ali is not the only one whose vision of Pakistan then is left out, right? And it's also because Chaudhry Rahmat Ali had a falling out with the top Muslim League leadership, calling Qaid-e-Azam as Quisling-e-Azam, referring to the Norwegian Nazi collaborator Quisling. And I think so. More than that, I would be interested in the competing notions or ideas about the Qaum, then the Sultanate, so to speak, right? So, and this is partially what I've tried to do in an earlier sort of in another earlier.
I think. Sorry. I think it may be useful for the audience if you explain in one sentence how you use the word Sultanate.
As the foundation of as a state, basically. because Professor Kamran was saying that Pakistan was, imagined later from. So I mean, for me, I think that the competing notions about the Qaum are more kind of in that sense interesting, or they reveal more about the competing visions for the state itself, right? So in that co-edited volume with Megan Robb, Muslims Against the Muslim League, critiques of the idea of Pakistan, it sort of like helps understand that there seems to be some understanding that a Muslim Qaum exists, but what is the definition of that Muslim Qaum, and what kind of a politics is going to help safeguard the interests of that Muslim community, right? So it is. So I would put Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's ideas, or Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's pamphlets, within that kind of like debate. It's less about his vision for Pakistan and more about his vision for the Muslim Qaum in India. And in that sense, whether it's Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, whether it is Hussain Ahmad Madani, or whether it is Abul Kalam Azad or Ghaffar Khan, they all have, in some ways, some places shared, but mostly dissimilar ideas about Muslim Qaum. And this is where they do not find a space in the post-colonial moment.
Sure. Tahir, I'm just going to ask you to speak. Just 1 second. I purposely, of course, gave you Rahmat Ali's example because I know it is on an extreme side. I'm not sure he would be very happy to know that you're calling it a pamphlet, because I think he wrote rather a few pages. But it's interesting that he actually calls it Pakistan, and the subtitle is "The Fatherland of the Pak Nation." Is the subtitle, and which is interesting. 1935 also being the year of the Government of India Act, which has there is a cadence to it. Tahir, you wanted to say something.
Well, that was very well said on the part of Dr. Qasmi. In fact, Rahmat Ali, it was quite an idiosyncratic formulation of a nation. That now or never was the first pamphlet or the few pages that came out from Cambridge in 1933, in fact. And then he wrote continuously. And when Pakistan came into being, Pakistan was spelled differently from how Rahmat Ali conceived it. Yes, it was it was Pakistan without I. So, and then he criticized Pakistan, and he said it's Pakistan or Pistan. So, Nilanjan, you have a smattering in Persian as well as your grasp on Urdu is quite good. So you might be knowing what does it mean by Pistan. And then his notion was that of if you just revert the order of India, it is the land of
Dinia,
Dinia, yes, land of Dinia. He was not in favor of separatism, Muslim separatism. He wanted to control Hindus, and he wanted to side with Sikhs, with the help of Sikhs and Jains and other people. So the inveterate enemies for Chaudhry Rahmat Ali were Hindus. So he was a bit of a pan-Islamist. So I have argued somewhere else that the politics that Muslims of India were quite enamored with till 1940s was pan-Islamic in its very essence. Like Iqbal. Iqbal's politics was nothing but pan-Islamist. It was only after 1940s that their politics became territorialized. And similarly, there's another thing that really intrigues me, mystifies me rather, that Dr. Qasmi talks about citizenship, its legality and its ideational manifestation. So when it comes to ideational manifestation, it links it up with Islam. And in Islam, there is no idea of citizenship, so far as I know. Because when there was a caliphate, the Muslims were called citizens. I don't think so. And later on, it was Mulukiyat, or it was monarchy, the dispensation of monarchy. And there too, there was no idea of citizenship. So how can these two ideas, legal as well as ideational, can be conflated to conjure up into existence some composite idea of citizenship, which is legal as well as ideational. So that is something which is really bothersome to a
Okay.
person like.
Ali, do you want to come back on it? Zehra and Zebunissa, I'll then come back to ask you people to comment as well. But Ali, do you want to just quickly comment on
Sure. Yeah, I think but there is, this notion of a modern Islam and this imagination of Medina being the first constitutional state, and the Charter of Medina, the first democratic constitution of the world. So there is this modernist answer to this question, and also the ulama board trying to reread classical fiqh to come up and to imagine a new kind of a political subjectivity in in the post-colonial or after the empire sort of like context, right? So I will briefly talk about it in the second chapter as to how the ulama are trying to address these issues.
Great, thank you. Zehra, did you want to come back on any of the things we were talking about?
Actually,
Or any other questions?
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on a thread of this conversation actually, because I think that there's something really compelling about the book, but that also raises the question, which is which insufficiently or sufficiently imagined Pakistan should we think about, the one before partition or the one after? And I think it's almost like what is being called, and I agree that I disagree with the insufficiently imagined pace. It's clear that there's been so many imaginings. But I think maybe if you could comment on what changes precisely in the imaginations, and I think maybe what was being said just now about the difference between the legal and the ideational, is that one axis perhaps that we can think about what happens when some of the ongoing ideational debates, of course, that doesn't stop. It hasn't stopped until today, but that the legal just becomes so all-consuming in all of the different ways, including with not just in the bureaucratic debates, but even later with the question of Ahmadis being declared as non-Muslims and that having to go through a legal process, a parliamentary process, etc. Yeah, if you could speak to that, like, are we seeing two different ways of imagining Pakistan before and after, and how would you sort of conceptualize that across the colonial, post-colonial divide?
Ali?
Yeah, in that sense, I mean,
Nilanjan, can I throw a spanner here?
Sure, briefly, please.
Excellency, that's it's a spanner in a way. Don't take it seriously, but I want your comment. Amber bin Abad said that Pakistan, the imagining of the citizen of Pakistan is Sunni, male, and Punjabi. So in which everyone else is excluded. So please comment on that also while answering Zehra's question. Thank you.
Ali, there you have it.
Yes, I mean, in that debate, I'm a very, in that sense, Hegelian, that I prioritize the ideational part, and I feel that it's the ideational shift which has subsequently has impacted other things, as I pointed out, Sadia Said's argument of desecularization. So in that sense, it's that the law and and state institutions themselves have been impacted because of these ideational changes. And as I pointed out earlier, as I was summarizing some of the arguments, that for me, among other things, other than like writing a book about, about citizenship, about different aspects of nation making, state making, is also a project of retrieval, right? It's that by historicizing state praxis, we can within that locate and historically identify uh, patterns which could have shaped a different kind of like an outcome. And for that purpose, I am interested in looking at more broadly as to how, again, that post-colonial moment was generating all sorts of new ideas and excitement, right? And it's through in that moment of excitement and this feeling of newness that this moment has enabled us to think creatively about new ways of being or new ways of political subjectivity that that a careful reading of that period and analysis of that period perhaps can be useful in seeing as to how people were thinking of themselves as being Pakistani. A small section of people being thinking of themselves being Pakistanis back then. But there is no, I think, I do not have any disagreement to where what Ambar Ibad has said about it's a very, it remains a very urban Muslim Sunni Punjabi male notion of who can ideally belong to Pakistan, and this is and it is that kind of like majoritarian ethos of the nation, which has been which the state has tried to hegemonize and extend to all paths, and has which has failed and which has led to so much of violence and resistance.
Thank you. Zebunissa, you must have something to say.
Yes, thank you so much. Just wanted to, going back to this idea of Qaum and these different trajectories and different conceptions of it. One of the things that, I'm working on, I work on internationalism, and one of the things that the book sort of reveals is precisely this transformation from Qaum, from an international or kind of global universal signifier to a territorialized notion. And I think that's to Zehra's question of what's the shift. It's that shift, but that for many people, think people like, Hasrat Mohani or Maulana Bashani or even Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, the part of a kind of pan-Islamic identity was coexisting with the secular territory as well. And that's the sort of transformation. So that's why Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's signifier is sort of, here or there, because what the real project does become, how do you make Qaum and territory, Qaum and state one, right? How do you, and make a claim for it wants it to be something special. But then beyond the book, we can see, it really from the postscript, we can get an idea that, of course, that was also that idea of Qaumiyat as an international or a global thing is also reworked for the Saltanat, for the state, particularly the military establishment that kind of uses it as a way to say we have claims over sort of Afghanistan, we have claims over, and once it loses, especially when it loses the eastern part and with the liberation of Bangladesh, it kind of turns back to look towards Medina itself as a kind of emblem of pan-Islamism. Yeah. So that is also moving. The idea of a non-territorial Qaum is also, and I think the great implication of this work is to really look at decolonization as a part of intellectual history, and a form of in an intellectual project, and how that changed from something that was emancipatory, where nationalism and internationalism could work together, to actually one that was about the sort of territorialized, majoritarian, and necessarily exclusive project, which was in service of, and in Pakistan's case, the service of more than its people, the state.
Okay, great. Ali, do you want to respond to it briefly? Because we're going to run out of time in about a minute.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zaib. It's a fantastic commentary on, and especially bringing these different threads together of, these wider imaginations, whether they are pan-Islamic or these are like the socialist internationalism, and how they're linked with people like Mohani and others, and how And also the question of which I, would have liked to emphasize even more, that that this this realization that there is a decolonial movement in Pakistani history, and where people were actively engaged in that kind of like a discussion, and which may not be as pronounced as it is in case of, let's say, India and other places.
Yeah.
But perhaps I think it's clear that there was this sense of that moment, and hence Pakistan's history, as you pointed out, must be read as a wider history of decolonization.
Great. Thank you very much. We've sadly run out of time. This has been great. I do want to thank all of you, but I do just also want to say, this being the last event of the academic year, that, I have said to so many people at so many events that if there's one good thing that came out of the pandemic, it is that we all as academics became tech savvy and can use things like Zoom and all, and can actually convene these kinds of discussions, which are so well appreciated by so many people. Thank you so very much, Zebunissa Aziz, Tahir Kamran, and Zehra Hashmi, for your comments, and congratulations, Ali Usman Qasmi, for your book as well as for the book award. Goodbye.
Thank you.